Socialization and Spanish learners in Spain with expert Spanish speakers and the role of listeners. And Rachel Shively will talk to us about that.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I'm adjusting my microphone here. All right. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working then? Am I projecting? Okay, excellent. Oh, so this one's not. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. You will notice that the title of the presentation is slightly different. It's the same presentation, and it's still about pragmatics, language use in context. And my focus is on listener responses in second language Spanish over the course, longitudinally, of a study abroad experience. And listener responses could be verbal or nonverbal, these little brief expressions that as a non-primary speaker in any particular moment in an everyday conversation, we might say in English, mm-hmm, uh-huh, yeah, right. Or do nonverbals such as nodding the head or use gaze. I'm focusing only on the verbal listener responses. And we often think of listening as a passive activity, but in everyday conversation, the listener, the person in the role of the listener at any given moment, is actually quite active. So for example, the listener has a role in managing turn taking. So when I go, mm-hmm, and allow the primary speaker at that moment to continue talking, I'm passing up a turn to talk. In shaping the discourse, the listener can, by saying, oh, as a response to what has just been said by the primary speaker, may shape the ongoing discourse because the primary speaker may think, oh, okay, I've discovered this as a surprise for my listener. So it may change, that person may add more information about that she or he wouldn't have added prior to that. And the listener also has a role in creating intersubjectivity or shared understanding with the primary speaker, for example, by using an assessment like that's great, doing alignment work, demonstrating this shared understanding between the speaker and the non-primary speaker in that moment. And so we can consider these skills, as well as other skills, part of learners' interactional competence, that is, the use and competencies in using interactional resources in given very specific contexts, cultural and social, as well as recognizing within this construct of interactional competencies that interactions are always co-constructed, jointly constructed by the participants involved. So listener responses, despite their brevity, that they're very small, or brief expressions, can be somewhat complex for a second language learner. There is cross-linguistic variation, not to mention that in any particular speech community, there's can be considerable individual variation among speakers. So Jefferson back in the 80s observed that some users of American English use mm-hmm very often and others use it very infrequently. So there can be differences in speech communities and subtle differences between tokens. So the difference in depending on the context, the intonation, versus uh-huh in English, for example. So let me just say a little bit more exactly what I mean by listener responses, how I'm defining them for this project. It's talk produced by a listener, or as we recognize that a listener, when he or she says something, is also talking, we could call that person the non-primary speaker. Listener responses provide feedback to the primary speaker about how the talk has been received. And important here, distinguishing them from other contributions that a non-primary speaker might make, they ratify and support the speaker's talk without threatening to take the floor or contributing to topic development. So that's how I've defined this phenomenon. We can divide them into minimal responses, such as yeah, sí in Spanish, yes, yeah, right? Or non-minimal assessments, that's fantastic. Agreements, oh, that's true. Repetition, this is very common in Spanish, where you repeat a word or a phrase from the immediately prior utterance of the primary speaker. Sentence completions and brief clarification questions. So in the two language varieties that I'm looking at in this study, American English and Peninsular Castilian Spanish, there are some similarities between the two in terms of listener responses. There are some similarities in form. The three tokens up there, o, a, and exist in both languages. There's some similarities in function. News markers, that is, tokens or listener responses that mark something as newsworthy, as something notable. O and a have similar functions in Spanish and English. And continuers, those are have the function of passing up a turn at talk, such as and exist in both languages and have similar functions. But there are also differences. So Spanish has some lexical items, claro and ya, which can be both translated as right, more or less, don't exist in English. The non-word vocalization isn't really used as a listener response in English, but is used in Spanish. And intensity of O versus A, both as news markers. O is more common in English, A is more common in Spanish, and O in Spanish is a bit more intensive, like oh, it's a much more intense news marker. So looking at, and my interest is the second language pragmatic development of these listener responses. So there's been a handful of studies on this issue, primarily in Japanese, only one, Ding's 2007, focused on Spanish. And what has been found in those studies is that with regard to specific tokens, such as ne in Japanese, there has been shown to be an increase in use of these specific listener responses. Students may develop a greater ability to project the emerging discourse so that they are better able to do sentence completions. Learners sometimes increase their syntactic complexity of assessments over time. And some have observed that in everyday conversation, where native expert speakers are using listener responses in their role as listener, they provide a model for learners in those conversations for the use of listener responses in context. And also that there's considerable variation among learners in the use and acquisition of this feature. So my research, my jumping off point was most of these previous studies don't delve in too deeply into how listener responses are learned. So my aim here is to examine development over time in listener responses by 6 second language learners of Spanish who studied in Toledo, Spain for a semester. And they, in looking at their use of listener responses and how it developed over time in naturalistic conversations with expert-speaking age peers and their Spanish host families. So my research questions specifically were, first, in what ways were second language learners similar to and different from their native Spanish-speaking interlocutors in terms of listener response use? Second, in what ways did second language learners' listener responses change over time? And how did students report learning about listener responses? The participants, as I mentioned, were 6 undergraduate students from a large Midwestern university, 4 female, 2 male. They'd all had a minimum of 4 semesters of college Spanish before going abroad. They all chose to study for 1 semester in Toledo, Spain, and all of them chose to live with the host family. And they took sheltered, that is, classes with other foreign students, international students, at a language institute in Toledo. The primary data that I'll be looking at is the talk data, and those were naturalistic audio recordings, so this is why I'm focused only on the verbal, not the nonverbal, unfortunately, between the participants that they made themselves, between them speaking with either their host families and their expert-speaking, Spanish-speaking age peers. So each student recorded 8 30-minute conversations, evenly spaced out through the whole semester abroad. So each student recorded a total of 4 hours of conversations, and they varied the person with whom they recorded. So 1 week with the host family, 1 week with the age peer, 1 week with the host family, and so on. And the corpus has 24 hours total of naturalistic conversations. In addition to the talk data, I also analyzed students' language learning journals, which they wrote every single week over the course of the semester. And I was asking them general questions about social interaction and language learning during their study abroad experience. And I didn't ask them actually specifically about listener responses, but many of them found this to be a salient issue, so they wrote about it on their own. And then finally, at the very end of the semester, I did one-on-one semi-structured interviews with each of the students. So I analyzed the interviews and journals qualitatively, and with the talk data, I did a qualitative analysis, but I'm going to present primarily the quantitative results, from which I looked at 7 specific response tokens. So sí, yes, claro, right, ya, right, and o. These have varying functions depending on the context. So acknowledgements refer to just simply acknowledging the receipt of the information that the primary speaker has provided. So sí is a typical acknowledgement function, has that function. Agreement could be sí, for example. So agreeing with the speaker, expressing agreement. News marker, again, marking something previously said as newsworthy immediately prior utterance. And continuer is passing up a turn of talk. Other types of listener responses that I analyzed were brief agreement expressions, such as exacto, exactly, eso, that's it. Assessments, such as, oh, that's really interesting. Allo repetitions, this repeating a word or phrase from the immediately prior utterance from the primary speaker. Sentence completions and brief clarification questions. So the total number of listener responses that I analyzed was 8,310. And there you can see that's learners and native speakers, so they were all in the same conversations together. So this table shows you, it addresses the first research question where I wanted to just see, for one, what the learners did overall as a group and what the native Spanish speakers did overall as a group. And I'm looking at relative frequency of these listener responses instead of giving you the raw usage data, because some speakers spoke more than others or listened more than others. So to control for that, I'm just looking at how frequent each type of listener response was vis-a-vis other listener responses. So the learners are the bars in the red and the native Spanish speakers are the bars in the blue. And as you can see, the learners overwhelmingly more than the native Spanish speakers use this C quite frequently. And this is over the course of the whole semester. We'll look at development after this. Also, the learners used considerably more than the native Spanish speakers, as well as they used O rather than more frequently. And the native Spanish speakers were reversed. They used more than O. The native Spanish speakers on their part used more frequently claro, ya, and was never used by the learners. And the native Spanish speakers also produced quite many more assessments, allo repetitions, and sentence completions. So you can see that the participants and the native Spanish speakers and the learners used, except for they used the same types of listener responses, but used them in different frequencies. So I'm going to talk first about acknowledgement, agreement, and news marker expressions, the ones that I looked at, and then I'll talk about assessments and finally allo repetitions. So I observed that in 5 of the learners, over time, over the course of the semester abroad, they decreased their use of C. And on the bullet points below, you can see in time 1, for the group as a whole, the average use of C as a listener response vis-a-vis other listener responses, almost half, 45% of their listener responses were just the C or multiples of C, CCC or CC could be, I've counted that in the same category. And the range of individuals at time 1 was 33 to 69%. So an individual had almost 2/3 of his or her listener responses just this C. And then in time 8, the group as a whole reduced their amount of using C vis-a-vis other listener responses to 28%, with a much smaller range, 14 to 53%. And there was a corresponding increase in other types of listener responses, in particular assessments, but also some other acknowledgement and agreement expressions such as ya, claro, eso, exacto, es verdad. And as we saw in the previous slide, I had forgotten to mention that this shows us the type of input that the students are receiving in these conversations. So we see what they have heard in terms of listener responses. And on your handout, you have this as an example. I'm not going to talk about it very long, but I just wanted to give you a sample from the actual data. Samantha, one of the learners, these are pseudonyms, she was in the role of listener in this excerpt. And in line 4, she provides a listener response, sí, claro. And there, it's in time 4, so kind of in the middle of the semester. And there's an instance where claro starts to become used. And it becomes more frequent over the course of the semester. And CCC, although it's continued to be used, becomes gradually less frequent. So one of my third research question was, how did learners report learning about these listener responses? And so they reported learning them through observation and participation in conversation, as well as through explicit feedback in a couple of cases. So for example, Samantha wrote in her week 6 journal, by talking to my age peer, Ana, I'm starting to notice the times it is appropriate to say claro. I'm picking up on how to use it more appropriately. At first, a lot of new words and phrases were thrown at me at once, and as I can easier understand and comprehend the language, it is easier to see in which context to use them. So you can see she is paying attention to the use of this in context, and also alludes to the fact that as her listening comprehension improves, she's better able to pay attention to the use of this listener response. Another student, Chloe, pseudonym also, reported that her host mother had told her, and she wrote this in her week 3 journal, that she shouldn't use okay as a listener response. Since she's in Spain, she should say sí. And you can see that down below, that I found that in the first 3 recorded conversations that Chloe made, she used okay as a listener response 22 times, and in the last 5 recordings, she only used it once. So this appeared to have affected her usage. As one of the previous students I mentioned alluded to listening comprehension, Kyle, another pseudonym also, in his interview reflecting back on the semester, he said, "My host dad and I talked for 5 hours about Spanish history one day at the beginning of the semester. And I honestly didn't understand a thing. I was see the whole time. But now he talks and I can understand like basically everything he says." And so this might explain in part why this high use of C in the very beginning of the semester, in terms of listening comprehension, the students aren't quite understanding what's being said, and they might not want to commit to taking a stance, such as that's great if the person just said, my mother died, or what have you. So they're these minimal expressions, such as C, that could be used at pretty much any point in a conversation, just to acknowledge that what has been heard has been heard. And when you're pretending to listen, this is probably your best option. I'm moving on to the second type of listener response that I found changed over time, and this was the case of assessments, which I should point out can be listener responses, or they can be used by the primary speaker to assess his or her own talk or what he or she's talking about. So I'm looking at them just as listener responses. And assessments refer to evaluating the talk of the primary speaker and expressing the effective and epistemic stance of the listener, along with displaying alignment, agreement, and interest. So assessments can have various functions. So assessments increased over time. At time 1, 4% of all the learners' listener responses were assessments, range of 0 to 8%. At time 8, 9%, so it increased more than double, and the range also increased for the students. So, and this was seen with all 6 participants, that they increased their use of assessments. And they largely, over the whole semester, produced these in a pragmatically appropriate way. The assessments did not change in terms of their structures, so students from the beginning, for example, could use the structure "Qué interesante," how interesting. However, they were able to increase their use of different precise lexical items and incorporated new lexical items over the course of the semester. So in the beginning, it tended to be, the students tended to use more catch-all terms such as bien, bueno, good, great. And towards the end of the semester, they began to adopt more precise meanings such as pobrecito, poor guy, que horror, how awful, muy astuto, very astute in their assessments. However, even by the end of the semester, the range of different meanings expressed in assessments the repertoire was not quite as extensive as that seen in the native speakers. And this was alluded to by Kyle's comment in his week 1 journal. He said, "I have a hard time expressing feelings with my limited vocabulary of feelings." So how did they learn about assessments? So for example, Chloe wrote in her journal that she had been taught the word guay, cool, in Spain, in her conversation class. Then in week 2, she was exposed to the assessment que guay by her age peer, language partner, as an assessment and a listener response. And then in time 3, she herself produced this expression, this assessment que guay, as a listener when she was talking with her host mother. And she wrote about this usage saying, "I like that I can use another word besides bien, good, all the time." And you have that on your handout as well. The number 2, excerpt 2, shows Chloe as the primary speaker at this point in time, and Veronica, her age peer, uses ay que guay, how cool, in line 6 as a listener assessment. And then you see in segment excerpt 3 that Chloe is with her host mother, and she's the listener at this point in time, and she says, "Oh, okay," so reproduces the same assessment. Other things that students mentioned about learning about assessments. Samantha mentioned that in her week 9 journal, she said, "This week I noticed that when people are listening, they interject often with phrases to show emotion, such as que triste, how sad, or que interesante, how interesting, and other things like that." And she learned to use specific assessment by first observing her age peer. So she further said in the following week's journal, "Ana will often add to what I say or interject with que fuerte, oh my God, and show me with her expressions that she's interested in what I have to say." So I was really picking up on that, and when I would use that when I was talking to her. So you can see that she is exposed to this in natural conversation with her age peer, and she doesn't pick up just on the form, the que fuerte, she also notices its function, that is to express interest in what the speaker is saying. And finally, Jared pointed again to this issue of listening comprehension. He said, "I started to use listener responses a lot more since I've been in Toledo. For example, when I arrived, I spent so much time deciphering the conversations that I'd have to think about what to say to react instead of just reacting. My reaction time is now much faster. For example, when my host mother or father is telling me a story, I might say things like, que horrible, que that's horrible, or que tonto, that's silly. I originally made a conscious effort to use these expressions, but it quickly became a habit. So automatizing his use of these expressions and also not expending all of his cognitive resources on decoding the conversation, but being able to pay attention to his own interactions in the role of listener. The third listener response type was allorepetitions, and these are more frequent, tend to be more frequent in Spanish than in English. And you have an example just to show you what this looks like. Jared, pseudonym, one of the students, was talking with his host mother. He was in the role of listener here. In lines 3 and 4, the host mother says, well, Madrid is nice too, as the capital, and Jared repeats that very last part of her immediately prior utterance as the capital. So it's an example of an allorepetition. And the group as a whole increased over time from time 1 to time 8, from 3 to 7% in the use of this, so it seemed to increase. However, it was most prominent in 2 individuals, and also students, none of the students mentioned this issue in their journals, so they may not have been aware of it, possibly. So just to summarize the results, in terms of the first research question, the learners and native speakers largely employed the same types of listener responses, but with different frequencies, and learners more frequently used C and particularly in the beginning. Native speakers produce more assessments, allorepetitions, and sentence completions. In terms of development over time, I observed a decrease in C and a corresponding increase in other types of acknowledgement and agreement expressions, in addition to assessments and allorepetitions. So what could this possibly have to do with interactional consequence? I didn't analyze this in this presentation, but potentially, for example, with the use of acknowledgement and agreement expressions, if you're just using C, 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 C all the time, Shegloff has talked about this, that's often a way a listener demonstrates, or maybe doesn't want to, but unwittingly demonstrates that he or she's bored by just using the same one over and over again. So by varying your repertoire, you may be able to avoid this idea that you're sort of bored by what the primary speaker is saying. In terms of increasing in assessments, this I would argue shows a focus more on the relational aspects of the interaction, because with assessments you can do alignment, you can show your shared understanding, and you take a stance, either epistemic or emotional, regarding what the primary speaker has said. This is more emphasizing the relational aspects of the interaction. We saw that in the results that the students pointed to the importance of listening comprehension. And this has been discussed by Goodwin and Goodwin, for example, that they have said to take a stance coherent with the previous talk, the listener must comprehend the talk. And not understanding the talk, it's very risky to utter an assessment and take a stance, commit to a stance. And this has a parallel in L1 research. Hess and Johnson said that until a child has achieved sufficient automaticity and message comprehension to free attentional resources to reflect on his or her own comprehension state, back-channel responses or listener responses are not likely. And in the final research question that I looked at, how did the participants learn to use listener responses? Within the context of language socialization theory, we saw both implicit and explicit learning. So there was through observation and in participation. This tends to be the most important part of language socialization, is this implicit socialization. Just through participating in this activity, the students were able to learn how to use these language forms in context. But there was also an example of explicit feedback from the host mother to the learner. Practice using these in everyday conversation and improving listener comprehension. In terms of interactional competence, the learners in the results, it showed that they had gained new interactional resources that then they were able to employ in conversation, in everyday conversation, to manage turn-taking, to shape the ongoing discourse, to display stance, and to show alignment and develop intersubjectivity. And all of these things are relevant to developing relationships with users of the target language. And this is something that for study abroad students, we want to encourage them to develop relationships with people from the host culture. So some pedagogical implications, and this is my last slide, thank you. In addition to the benefit of participating in everyday conversations that it showed, because this provides the students with role models and input on how to use these listener responses in context, the results also suggest some specific areas that instruction could highlight. And as Gardner has pointed out, learners don't typically receive any instruction on this type of language usage, like being a listener in conversation. So we could draw learners' attention to more frequent use of allorepetitions in Spanish, for example, so cross-cultural differences in the types of listener responses used, the existence of this that they apparently didn't pick up on, and this difference between O and A, what the meaning of each is. And finally, as we saw, we could assist learners in developing a richer vocabulary to express their emotions in assessments in listener responses. So thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions and comments.
Thanks, Hi. Very nice findings. Thank you very much. I just had a practical question. Your opinion on the difficulty of the study itself. As a program administrator, I'm always thinking about the how of things. Just wondering what context did the students record, and how did they go about doing it, and how much trouble was it on their part to find these contexts and get the people to agree to let them be recorded?
Yeah, they did it for the purposes of my research study. I recruited these participants and they decided to participate, and I provided them with a very small amount of compensation. So I'm not sure that was the main motivation, although partly. I provided each of the students, the participants, with a digital audio recorder that they took with them. And they chose, they were given a schedule, so week 1, record with your host family, week 3, record with your age peer, etc. And so they were asked to do that, and almost all of them had a language partner that they were assigned to through their site in Toledo, so they had an age peer to talk to. Some of them actually recorded with people who were not their language partner, they just made a friend who was an expert Spanish speaker. So I don't think in that sense it was very difficult, and a couple of students commented something interesting that I think is valuable for program administrators, and that is that they really, in the end, they liked being forced to have these conversations and to record them, because otherwise they might have just sat with their host family and watched TV. But because I told them they had to talk, they actually had to have a conversation. So I thought that was interesting, and I've mulled over that as someone who is a coordinator of a program, study abroad program, thinking, how could we incorporate that into instruction to encourage them to really engage in conversation more than they might. Yeah, Wen-Hao.
I have a question too. As you mentioned, the interactional competence, I was wondering, and also maintain different relationships. I was wondering, obviously we're talking to different people, and I obviously don't speak Spanish. I was wondering if there is a social linguistic variation among native speakers or among different relationships in the ways that you use these responses, and were these students able to notice that differences? For instance, we've seen research, for instance, for women, we tend to hatch more. Maybe that is something that this is also related to. I was wondering if there's a social linguistic difference, and if the students were able to notice that.
Mm-hmm. As far as I'm aware, there isn't good research on that for me to cite and to explain, to say, point you to such and such study about social linguistic differences in listener responses in Spain. As far as I know, that's not really out there, but certainly there are differences. So there's more youthful expressions, and particularly the age peers use things like vaya, or more certain, listener responses with their age peers who were the second language learners, then did the host family. So there you could observe differences. The students didn't really pick up on that so much, except for perhaps the guay. That's sort of more youthful language, I suppose. None of the adult host family members used keguay, for example. That was limited to the age peers, and these were all university undergraduate level students. Thanks.
We're actually out of time, unfortunately. You can hold your questions to the end of our whole session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.